The official Kremlin channels have fallen into an unusual and deafening silence. There are no scheduled presidential appearances and no normal government updates. State-controlled television has stopped its regular shows. Instead, it is playing classical music and old documentaries. Russian history shows this only happens when something extremely serious is happening behind closed doors. The trigger for this silence appears to be a deep conflict between the presidential administration and the military leadership over how the war in Ukraine has been managed. Western intelligence agencies had been tracking growing friction inside Russia's security institutions for months. Intercepted communications showed frustration within senior military ranks about decisions coming from the Kremlin. These concerns were linked to high casualty numbers. They also reflected anger about what officers described as political interference in military strategy. Economic pressure from international sanctions added to the tension. The fear of a larger confrontation with NATO only made the situation more unstable. Many of these officials believed the political leadership was moving the country toward a larger and unnecessary disaster. This dissatisfaction gradually turned into a covert conspiracy. It involved a small circle inside the Russian security structure. These individuals believed the only way to prevent a national collapse was to intervene directly. The recent losses in the Donbas region played a major part. Intercepted messages described those operations as tactics that consumed soldiers without purpose. At the same time, rumors of nuclear escalation added fear inside the command structure. There were signs that NATO was preparing for possible direct involvement if the war crossed certain lines. All these factors created a belief among some leaders that the presidency had become a danger to the Russian state. The alleged detention of the president appears to have been planned with extreme precision. It was timed during a routine security briefing at one of the presidential residences outside central Moscow. Those who carried out the operation reportedly used the same protective protocols designed to shield the president. Access to the president is controlled by the Federal Protective Service. According to sources, some members of this service were either complicit or suddenly removed from duty using emergency authority orders. Another key part of the operation involved the Russian National Guard. This internal military force is commanded by Viktor Zolotov, who had long been known as loyal to the president. According to initial assessments, the plotters either secured cooperation from key deputies inside the Guard or convinced officers that the operation was necessary to prevent a national catastrophe. Some sources suggest that senior officers were shown fabricated emergency orders to gain compliance. Inside Moscow, certain areas were sealed by local FSB units. This happened quietly with no visible force. The goal was to isolate the main centers of political power before any loyal faction could mobilize. At the same time, control over government communication systems was taken over. Access was rerouted through monitored channels. This made it almost impossible for political leaders to coordinate a response. The entire operation relied on confusion and on the appearance of legitimate authority. Orders were delivered through the normal chain of command. So many who carried them out believed they were responding to real instructions. Following the operation, Russia entered a state of deep uncertainty. Government ministers reported they could not reach the presidential administration. The State Duma did not meet for an emergency session, and its speaker made no announcement. The behavior of state media provided the clearest sign that something major had occurred. When broadcasters stop normal news and shift to archival material, it usually means editors are not receiving guidance from senior officials. It is a sign of paralysis at the very top. The streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg remain mostly calm, but with an atmosphere of unease. On social media, the situation was far more chaotic. Telegram channels with ties to security services posted cryptic celebratory messages suggesting a major shift. Pro-Kremlin channels posted contradictory claims or went completely silent, Ordinary citizens received no clear information. Meanwhile, the Russian central bank halted trading on the Moscow exchange and shut down parts of the financial system to stop immediate panic. Other countries reacted cautiously. Leaders across Europe and North America received no reliable information in the first few hours and avoided making strong statements. A spokesperson for the United States National Security Council said that Washington was monitoring the situation with great seriousness. Behind the scenes, intelligence agencies began rapid communication. NATO called an emergency session to evaluate the status of Russia's nuclear command system. The highest priority was to ensure that all nuclear forces remained under stable control. In China, the reaction was tense. Russia is one of China's most important strategic partners. The Foreign Ministry released a short statement expressing confidence that Russia could maintain stability. The brevity of the message suggested deep concern. Chinese officials began urgent communication with Russian defense counterparts seeking clarity on the chain of command. Global markets immediately felt the shock. Oil prices climbed rapidly. Investors moved money into safer assets like gold. The uncertainty surrounding Russia's political future made energy markets extremely volatile. This was especially significant because Russian exports depend on stable long-term agreements, which now appeared uncertain. Some analysts compared this event to the 1991 coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev. But this comparison does not fully fit. That coup was an attempt to halt reforms by an ideological faction. The current situation appears to involve security institutions acting against a leader who had dominated the state for decades. A closer, though still imperfect, comparison might be the palace coups of the Russian Empire, when elite guards removed a ruler in the name of saving the state. Modern Russia has long had a tension between personalized power and institutional power. The presidency built a system that depended on the loyalty of competing security factions, the FSB, the military, and the National Guard. These groups were loyal to the individual leader more than to the constitution. This loyalty appears to have collapsed under the pressure of the war in Ukraine. That collapse now threatens the stability of the entire system. There are major questions about the legality of detaining a sitting president. The Russian constitution allows removal only through impeachment by parliament. If the plotters want to maintain a sense of legal order, they must quickly build a political structure to justify their actions. This may include a declaration of national emergency by the Security Council and the rapid convening of parliament to formalize temporary authority. The stance of other power groups remains unclear. The Prime Minister and several ministers have not been seen. Regional governors hold significant influence, especially leaders like the head of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. His reaction could determine whether this crisis stays limited to Moscow or spreads across the country. Economically, Russia faces a dangerous moment. The temporary closure of the financial market is only a short-term method to slow panic. Russia's economy has been structured around wartime production and strict capital controls. With the top leadership removed, this structure may collapse. Access to foreign reserves could become limited. The ruble, which has been supported by state intervention, is at immediate risk. Banking systems may face mass withdrawals. Oil and gas exports may be disrupted as foreign buyers question who now represents legal authority. The Russian public is experiencing a psychological shock. For more than 2 decades, the president has been the central figure of national identity. His sudden disappearance breaks the narrative that the state and its leader are inseparable. For loyal supporters, this may feel like a betrayal. For quiet critics, it may represent an uncertain opportunity. But above all, it creates fear. Many people do not know which authority to trust. The normally passive social contract has been replaced by confusion. Experts warn that claims of a peaceful legal transition are fragile. Removing a powerful leader almost always requires harsh consolidation of power. The unity of the plotters may not last. They were united by dissatisfaction, not by shared political goals. Conflict between different factions inside the security establishment is likely. The control of information will now shape the outcome. Whoever can speak first on state television and present a coherent narrative to the Russian public will gain a major advantage. The stability of the nuclear chain of command remains the greatest global concern. Russian doctrine requires presidential authorization for nuclear use. Without clarity on who holds that authority, the situation is unstable, even if the actual risk is still low. The next steps must happen quickly. The new authority must appear on television. It must give a clear explanation for its actions. It must present accusations against the detained president. It must claim temporary power through constitutional interpretation. It must show that security forces support the transition. Only then can it begin diplomatic engagement with foreign governments. 37 hours after the Kremlin went silent, the state media finally broadcast a coordinated message. Russian television channels cut to a large conference room. 11 officials sat at a long table. At the center was Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. On either side sat the director of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, and the commander of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov. Also present were the chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, senior members of the Security Council, and leaders from Parliament. Belousov announced the creation of a new temporary authority called the State Committee for National Salvation. He stated that this committee had assumed control because the president had been declared incapacitated and was now under investigation for crimes including treason. His speech was careful and legal in tone. Bortnikov followed with claims about corruption networks inside the presidential administration. Zolotov assured the public that order was being maintained. A decree then appeared on the screen stating that a national emergency was now in effect. Curfews were declared and travel restrictions applied to officials. International governments recognized this as a military security takeover, even though parliamentary leaders were included. Western countries issued cautious statements. The United States emphasized nuclear stability. European countries debated how to respond. Eastern European states called for non-recognition, while others pushed to maintain limited communication. China refused to endorse the new authority and called for legal resolution inside Russia. The Moscow exchange did not reopen. The ruble collapsed in foreign markets. The central bank introduced harsh emergency controls. Russian energy companies saw senior executives flee or disappear. Military officers were placed in charge of infrastructure. Global energy markets entered a period of shock. Inside Russia, 3 separate realities emerged. State media promoted the committee as legitimate. Online nationalist channels accused the committee of betrayal. Liberal channels expressed fear about what might come next. Meanwhile, everyday life became more difficult. Curfews were enforced. Stores reported shortages. The public waited for clarity. The military situation also shifted. The committee ordered internal troop movements to secure Moscow. This weakened Russian positions in Ukraine, which Ukrainian intelligence quickly noticed. Control over nuclear forces entered an unusual condition. The committee placed the arsenal under heightened security to prevent unauthorized use, but without clear legal authority. This raised concerns in Western capitals. Over the next 48 hours, the committee moved to consolidate power. It dissolved parts of the presidential administration. It placed law enforcement under military control. It removed regional governors and replaced them with temporary administrators. Resistance was rare and quickly suppressed. The director of the Federal Protective Service barricaded himself in his headquarters, but was arrested after a short standoff. Ramzan Kadyrov openly opposed the committee and pledged loyalty to the president. His stance became a major question for the future stability of the Russian Federation. This is the situation as it stands. Russia is entering a period that may reshape its political system, its relationship with the world, and the future of the war in Ukraine. The next days will determine whether this becomes a managed transition or a prolonged internal conflict inside one of the world's most powerful states.